Hey, what's going on, gang? This is Nate on the Stone. Welcome back to my channel, and this week we are talking about one of the most important cases before the Supreme Court this season, a case that could potentially abolish sex. The case in point is R.G. and G.R. Harris Funeral Home v. EEOC and Aimee Stephens. Briefly, the facts of the case are these. The R.G. and G.R. Funeral Home in Detroit, Michigan has a dress code that does comply with federal regulations. Male directors wear dark suits, female directors wear skirt dresses. This is actually the dress code for funeral homes across the board. A, because it's professional looking, and B, because it's unobtrusive. Because when a director is meeting with a grieving family, the attention is not supposed to be on the director. In 2013, an employee and director for 6 years, Anthony Stephens, announced that he was going to be taking his 2 weeks vacation. Fine and dandy. But then he also added that after he returned, he was going to be wearing women's clothing and from then on would be known as Aimee Stephens. This put the Harris Funeral Home in a bind. Would Stephens, for example, start using the ladies' bathroom, which would make female employees and female patrons of the funeral home uncomfortable? Would the sight of a biological male dressed as a woman be disturbing and distracting for grieving families? Because of these real-world considerations, the funeral home decided to let Stephens go with a severance package. I really feel like I need to emphasize that point because so many of the stories out there talking about this case fail to mention that little detail. Stephens and the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, turned right around and sued the Harris Funeral Home for discrimination. And here is where it gets interesting and terrifying. The EEOC is arguing before the Supreme Court that the funeral home firing Stephens violates Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which criminalizes discrimination based on race, religion, nationality, and sex. In other words, the EEOC is arguing before the court that firing Stephens because he was a biological male who insisted on dressing as a woman because he claims to be a trans woman is sex discrimination. The EEOC lays this out bold as brass on its website, where it says that discrimination based on gender identity is sex-based discrimination. The EEOC argues this from a decision from 2012, Macy versus Department of Justice, where the EEOC claimed that gender identity discrimination is sex-based discrimination necessarily. Necessarily because gender identity discrimination, quote, can be viewed as sex discrimination based on nonconformance with gender norms and stereotypes, unquote. At this point, I've got to put a pause on the video and remind everyone that no one, and I mean no one, has ever conflated biological sex and gender identity as the same thing. If you remember a couple of weeks ago when we talked about non-binary lesbians and how all that works, or how it actually all doesn't work, you'll remember that even postmodern gender ideology states that there is a difference between biological sex and someone's gender identity. That's the whole reason behind the genderbread man and the gender unicorn. But the EEOC is throwing all that aside and saying that your sex only depends on your own interpretation of what you are. And the courts are actually kind of predisposed to this newest permutation in gender ideology. The initial trial judge actually ruled in the Harris Funeral Home's favor, but a federal appeals court in Cincinnati ruled in Stephens' favor, saying that discrimination based on gender identity is the same thing as sex-based discrimination. The appeals court also ruled separately that the funeral home owner, quote, had sex stereotypes about Stephens based on appearance and dress, in that she doesn't conform to what he deemed to be female presenting, unquote. Which is why this whole case went before the Supreme Court, where oral arguments were heard a week ago from this recording on October 8th. And ideologues have a big interest in this case. There is first and foremost the argument that this is about transgender rights, that Stephens' rights were unjustly taken away from him because of his identity/sex. Vice News took this a step further, saying that not just transgender rights were on the line, but women's rights in general because, quote, Stephens was fired for her supposed inherent inability to conform to her employer's subjective perspective on what women at work should look like. So if the Supreme Court says that's legal, every woman in the United States may then also be forced to conform to an employer's subjective, stereotyped idea of how a woman should look at work if she wants to keep her job. Chase Strangio, a transgender lawyer for the ACLU, went a step further, saying that it wasn't just about transgender rights, it was about basic survival, pointing out that amici briefs for the funeral home refer to Stephens as a man and refuse to use his preferred pronouns, all of which perpetuates the idea that Stephens isn't actually a real woman, a position which, Strangio argues, perpetuates anti-trans violence. And especially in the midst of an anti-trans epidemic that left 28 people dead just last year, doesn't this sort of thing need to be squashed by the Supreme Court in a ruling in Stephens' favor? Okay then. In the first place, what happened to Stephens is not sex-based discrimination. Sex-based discrimination happens when an employer treats someone substantially differently from other employees because of the sex that he belongs to. So an example of actual sex-based discrimination, and one given by Ryan T. Anderson, would be an employer who rewards a male employee for being brash and aggressive because that's a positive trait in this company, but then turning right around and berating a woman employee for acting brash and aggressively because that's not how women act. Now, the 1998 Supreme Court case, Onkel versus Sundowner Offshore Services Incorporated, ruled that Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act does not require asexuality or androgyny, which means that the law does not require employers to turn a blind eye towards sex. And that means that not all of the different treatments that men and women receive in the workplace are discriminatory because men and women are actually different. This is why, for example, men and women can still have separate restrooms. This is also why a female lifeguard could be fired for refusing to wear a top while her male colleague wouldn't be, because on a woman, breasts are secondary sex organs, and a male lifeguard would be fired for showing off his sex organs in public just like a woman would. And this is why Stephens' firing is not sex-based discrimination, because a female employee of the Harris Funeral Home who decided to dress like a man would have been given the pink slip too. In the second place, contrary to Strangio, recognizing biological reality is not going to erase trans people out of existence. Ironically, it will be the erasure of the sex distinction itself, which will erase trans people out of existence. Trans people only exist because there is a recognized mismatch between their biological sex and their gender identity, or at least they're told that there's a mismatch between the two, and then this idea is implanted into their heads. But if identity is the sole arbiter of biological sex, then there can't be any trans people. All there are people whose identity matches their biological sex, matches their body, and people whose gender identity doesn't match their bodies. And no, there isn't a mass epidemic of violent deaths against trans people, regardless of what the media says. Andy Go has detailed how each of the 28 trans deaths in 2018 was not, repeat, not due to hatred or bigotry against trans people. That link to that Twitter thread is down in the description box. We've talked before here on The Stone about how the new transgender ideology is contrary to both science and biology, how using genuine intersex people to push the sex spectrum that is now becoming popular in scientific circles actually depends on the distinction between male and female itself. So if the Supreme Court rules in Stephens' favor and legally abolishes sex, that is going to open up a whole Pandora's box. The first thing that's going to happen is that everything is going to hinge on stereotypes, which is actually kind of ironic, seeing as how the appeals court and Vice News berated the Harris Funeral Home for actually adhering to stereotypes. But the only reason why stereotypes about men and women exist in the first place is because those stereotypes are based on truths, especially the big, bold, unapologetic, inescapable truth that men and women are actually different. That's the only way that we can identify, for example, a tomboy. It's only because we know that the tomboy is ontologically a woman that we can recognize her and classify her as a tomboy in the first place. If the sexes are actually abolished, then the only way that people are going to be able to show that they clearly identify as a man or a woman is by slavishly following stereotypes. Want to show that you're unmistakably a man? Wait, I'm sorry, let me try this again. Want to show that you unmistakably identify as a man? You're going to have to grow a lumberjack beard, despise pink, keep all of your emotions locked away deep inside, and grow biceps as large as the national deficit. Same thing for women, 1950s style dresses, makeup, and giggling to the max. And if you're not a man or a woman but identify as something else, you're going to have to rack your brains to figure out how you convey that identity to the rest of the world and then follow that stereotype religiously. That's not empowerment. That's slavery. The second thing that's going to happen is the evaporation of rights. If your sex, the basic biological identity that you have, is only based on your subjective feeling, does that mean that other aspects of your identity are only based on your own subjective sense of identity? Can a white person, for example, identify as a black person like Rachel Dolezal did? And does that mean that that white person now is eligible for affirmative action in universities and colleges? Can a person identify as a senior citizen and start drawing off of Social Security even if biologically that person is only 33 years old? Can a person identify as a soldier even though he's never been within 10 miles of the military and take advantage of certain loan forgiveness programs that are offered only to military personnel? And of course, we've already had people take the next step and identify as cats, dragons, and aliens. Are these people even human still? If they aren't human, do they still have rights? If by definition humanity is divided into male and female, then if those concepts are no longer concrete realities, can the human race itself even exist like it has for the last 10,000 years? And if the human race is no longer the actual human race, then can human rights, or natural rights even exist anymore? Rights now become as amorphous as identity, which means that they can only be grasped onto and held by the will to power. And to all the people out there who don't have power, well, you just might have to get used to the idea that you don't have rights anymore. The third thing that's going to happen is the most terrifying of all. It's the dissolution of everything into the nothing. All of you watching this video, everyone, past, present, and future, myself included, we're only here because of the sex difference between men and women. Our very existence screams out the division of the human race into the two sexes, just like our natural abilities to become either fathers or mothers screams it out again from our own bodies. To erase sex is not just to erase our own identities, it's to erase the identities of our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, all the way back to the beginning of time. Furthermore, it's to erase the identities of everyone being born right now and going to be born, to shove them into a new world of gods and monsters, where there is nothing objective, nothing solid. Instead, everything simply dissolves into the amorphous ether of the nothing, where things can only be shaped and held onto by an act of will, yours or someone else's. And this has been the end goal of the sexual revolution from the start. To quote Margaret McCarthy, "There is no question about the nihilistic objectives of the new philosophy of sex. Those objectives were already in play at the beginning of the sexual revolution. This was conceived by its founder, Wilhelm Reich, to be the most comprehensive of revolutions because it rebelled against the very principle of reality itself, rejecting the finalistic notion of sexual acts. And if there is only nothing, that means there are no human rights, no democracy, no truth. There are only norms, and norms can change on the turn of a dime. And they offer no one any real protections or real happiness. In a world filled only with the nothing, we stand alone and naked under a cold black sky." And some people actually want to call that freedom. But what say you? Will the abolition of sex lead us to the brave new utopia? Or will it lead us to a
new world of gods and monsters?
As always, let me know your thoughts, ideas, and opinions down in the comment box below. Well, that about wraps up everything for right now, gang. As always, if you liked the video, whether you agreed with me or not, don't forget to show your support by giving it a like, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a comment down below. And if you like videos about the culture, politics, and religion, but from a different POV, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell for notifications so you'll always know when I post new videos here every Tuesday. Videos you're not going to want to miss. As always, thank you for watching, for giving me a bit of your day. Thank you to everyone who has already subscribed to my channel. And I will see you all here next week, gang, on top of the stone. Ciao.